Let's begin with a short review of some of the things we covered yesterday before we move on. So in terms of cultivating mindfulness, in Buddhism, of course, cultivating mindfulness is about improving our attention skills, developing single-pointed concentration. So in Buddhism, this is often called Shamata practice. And this word Shamata, of course, is a Sanskrit word. We can divide that into two parts. Shama means calm or non-discursive. And ta means to remain or abide. So often Shamata is translated as calm abiding in English, meaning a mind that is not only calm, but is abiding, focusing single-pointedly on an object. So of course here we're talking about cultivating a calm, clear and focused mind. Now in this practice, there are normally two qualities that are mentioned that we are to cultivate: stability and clarity. So stability is to be able to focus on an object without becoming distracted, and clarity is to be able to focus on that object in a very clear way, overcoming dullness. But yesterday we added a third quality that normally you won't see in the meditation texts, and I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to in our modern society, and that is the quality of relaxation. Because the reality is that many of us, of course, in the modern world, lead very hectic lives, fast-paced lives, constantly bombarded by stimulus. Our minds tend to be very overactive and chaotic. And so therefore, whenever we want to concentrate on anything in our life, we tense. But that is not a sustainable way of focusing, because we know from our own experience, if we focus on something with a lot of tension for a longer period of time, we become very agitated and completely exhausted. So this is not a sustainable way of focus. So therefore, the first quality we want to cultivate in this practice is relaxation, to have a relaxed body and relaxed mind. And it's only on the basis of a relaxed body and mind that we'll be able to develop sustainable stability and clarity. So these three qualities of relaxation, stability, and clarity can be likened to the analogy of a tree. That first, we need to sink deep roots of relaxation that will support a strong trunk of stability. The stronger the trunk of stability, the higher the branches and leaves of clarity can grow. So this is the analogy, I think, that's very helpful. Now, in this practice, of course, we are focusing on an object. But the question is, what object should we use in this practice? And the general recommendation is use the object that works best for you. In this 2 days, we are focusing on 3 particular objects, which I think each one of them has a lot of benefits for us in our modern society. The object that we worked with yesterday, of course, was the breath, focusing on the physical sensations of the breath, probably the one that's most widely emphasized in most Buddhist traditions. And there we did a few variations of that practice yesterday. The full body breath practice, noticing sensations of the breath anywhere in the body, then focusing on the abdomen, and then lastly focusing at the entrance of the nostrils. The 2 objects that we're going to work with today are the mind and resting in awareness. And we'll describe those practices shortly. In fact, we'll do the mind practice in this session and the awareness practice in the next session. And both of those also have a lot of benefit for us in our modern society. And again, we'll talk about those benefits shortly. So the general recommendation then is pick the object that works best for you and then stick with that object. Because if we keep changing the object we focus on, we're not going to progress very far. But there's also another possibility of what object to focus on, and for that I'd like to read again from this book I read from yesterday, Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace, the book about this shamatha practice. And he says the following on page 6. He says, to guide meditators along these 10 stages, and the 10 stages were the ones we looked at yesterday briefly, these 9 stages plus the result of shamatha. To guide meditators along these 10 stages, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I have found effective for the people in the modern world. These 3 techniques are the basis for the 3 divisions of this book. For the first 4 stages, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continuously returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. Beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. And that's the practice we're going to do now in this session. In this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences, that is, all the events such as thoughts, mental images and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen or Great Perfection lineage, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. So that's the practice for the next session. This technique is called Shamata without an object. Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. The training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. You may use any one of these 3 methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So what he's saying is that, in general, find an object that works for you and stick with that and use that all the way along to shamatha. Another option that he's suggesting here is that for the first 4 stages, it could be good to use the breath as the object. And then from the 5th stage through to the 8th stage, in these middling stages, you could then switch to observing the mind, which is what we're going to do now. And then for the last couple of stages, to shift to the awareness practice, which we're going to do in the next session. So that's also a possibility. But what we don't want to do is every week or so keep changing the object that we focus on. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far. And so remember, in this practice, the 2 main tools we're using are mindfulness and introspection. And we saw that again in this diagram here down the bottom. The meditator, in their left hand is a rope. That's symbolizing mindfulness. So we are tying our mind with a rope of mindfulness to the object. So remember, mindfulness here is simply our ability to hold the object, to remember the object, to not forget it, to not become distracted. But then the second tool in their right hand is this hook, and that is symbolizing introspection. So introspection is like quality control. Introspection is monitoring the mindfulness. How is the mindfulness going? Are we still holding the object, or are we starting to become dull or distracted? So introspection is monitoring that, and if we notice that we become dull or distracted, then simply reapply mindfulness to the object. So these are the two main tools we use. And then also, of course, in these 2 days, we're looking at emotional balance. So yesterday we saw that now we tend to have a lot of emotional imbalance, meaning that we often tend to react to stimulus in an unhealthy way. We tend to react to pleasant stimulus with craving and attachment. We tend to react to unpleasant stimulus with aversion, hostility, anger, hatred, and so forth. And often then, if the stimulus gets too overwhelming, we either try to suppress our reactions to them, or we actually try to cut from the stimulus. We sort of just like end up in this space where we're not registering the stimulus. All of those reactions are very unhealthy. So what we are wanting to do is have emotional balance, which means not to cut from stimulus, to be fully present with stimulus, and not to react to that stimulus by either getting caught up and reacting or trying to suppress, but rather being fully present and responding in a healthy way rather than reacting. And how to respond in a healthy way is particularly through loving kindness and compassion. And so we looked at the loving kindness practice yesterday, particularly together with how to deal with attachment. And today we're going to look at the compassion practice, and together with that, how to deal with anger. So that's this afternoon's topic for after lunch. So that's a short review of some of the things we covered yesterday. So let's now go to the Shamata practice for this session, and that is that we're going to use the mind as the object of Shamata practice. So to be very clear about what the object is, the object of this shamatha is our mind plus any mental events that arise in the mind, which means thoughts, emotions, memories, images, and so forth. So we are to observe our mind and observe any of these mental events as they arise and pass, without getting caught up in them, without trying to get rid of them. So what is not part of the object that we're focusing on is any sense experiences. So in this practice, we're not focusing on any sensations in the body, sounds, visual objects, smell, or taste. They probably will arise, but we're not trying to block sounds or sensations, but we're just not interested in them. We're not paying attention to them at all. Let them be there. We're only interested in mental events, focusing on thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images, observing them as they arise and pass. Now, many of you will probably find this much more challenging than yesterday's practice, observing the breath, for two reasons. One is that the mind is a more subtle object. The breath is something physical, tangible, more easy to focus on. The second reason that we'll probably find it challenging is we do not have a habit of simply observing our thoughts and emotions. Our strong habit is if a thought or emotion comes up, we grab hold of it and off we go. We follow it. Or if it's unpleasant, the other habit we have is we try to suppress it. We don't have a habit of simply observing them arise and pass. But of course, if we can develop that habit, and of course it just needs practice to develop that habit, if we can really develop the habit of being like an impartial observer or witness, simply observing these mental events arise and pass, then we're going to receive a lot of benefit. Because now we tend to get caught up in our thoughts and emotions and memories and often get overwhelmed by them. And therefore we often end up being the slaves of our own mind, tormented by our own thoughts and emotions and memories. If we develop this ability to simply observe them arise and pass, we're free of them, which means we'll become the masters of our own mind instead of being the slaves of our own mind. So a lot of benefit with this practice. So in this practice, again, we are simply observing the mind, or technically we say the space of the mind, and whatever mental events arise in that space. Observing these mental events arise and pass without following them, without trying to get rid of them. In this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open. Of course, in general, in meditation, the general recommendation is to have the eyes slightly open, because if we have the eyes closed in meditation, probably you'll drift into dullness. But very much in this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, either partially or naturally open, whichever you prefer. And there are a number of reasons why that is the case, why it's very much recommended in this practice. And to talk about some of these reasons, I'd like to first again read from Alan Wallace's book on page 86. And he says the following. And he's quoting a text that says, and the text says, "Let your gaze be vacant." So that's the instruction. So now he's commenting on that. He says, "In this practice, it is important that your eyes are open, vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. If you have not meditated with your eyes open, you may find this uncomfortable, but I encourage you to get used to it." And that was my experience, was that when I first started meditating, I'm an agitated sort of person, so I found that having the eyes slightly open was just too much agitation. So actually I started meditating with my eyes slightly closed. That was quite helpful for agitation, but of course then I noticed I was just drifting into dullness. But then when I was introduced to this practice some years ago, and then I started meditating with my eyes open, I really found it very uncomfortable because I'm not used to it. But actually I very quickly got used to it, and now generally I tend to meditate only with eyes open. He says the following: "Blink as often as you like and don't strain your eyes in any way." So with the eyes open, we're not trying to hold them open, we're not trying to make them unfocused because that's straining the eyes, just resting gently your gaze in the space in front of you, and blink as often as you need. Let them be as relaxed as if you were daydreaming with your eyes open. By leaving the eyes open while focusing your attention on the domain of mental events, the artificial barrier between inner and outer begins to dissolve. Especially in our materialist society, we have gotten used to the idea that our thoughts and all other mental events are inside our heads. But this has never been demonstrated scientifically. All that is known in this regard is that mental events are correlated with neural events, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are located in the same place. Even without this materialist assumption that the mind is nothing more than a function of the brain, we naturally have a sense that we are looking out on the world from behind our eyes. But this sense of an independent subject or ego inside the head is an illusion. There is no scientific support for such a belief, and when it is inspected through rigorous contemplative inquiry, this autonomous thinker and observer inside the head is nowhere to be found. In this practice, by leaving your eyes open, but by directing your attention to the mind, this conceptually superimposed demarcation between inner and outer begins to erode. You begin to recognize that your thoughts are not occurring in here in your head, nor are they occurring out there in space. This practice challenges the existence of an absolutely objective space of the physical senses that is absolutely separate from the subjective space of the mind. You are now on a path to realizing the meaning of non-duality. So again, just to summarize the benefits of having the eyes open. One, of course, is that it will help improve clarity. With eyes closed, much easier to drift into dullness. Also, with eyes open, it helps us to be more in the present moment. With the eyes closed, it's much more easy to drift into the past and the future. And as Alan Wallace mentioned in his book, is that with the eyes open, this sense, this false sense of duality, this sense that there's a me in here and a world out there, begins to dissolve. Because with the eyes closed, there really is a strong sense there's a me in here and an objective world out there. With the eyes open, that artificial barrier starts to dissolve. And that is actually what we're trying to realize in the Vipassana practice. So if in Shamata practice, we're already starting to break that down, that false sense of duality, by having the eyes open, that's going to be very helpful when we go into the Vipassana practice later. The other benefit with having the eyes open in this meditation is that we'll be able to transition into daily life much better. Because also in daily life, we want to be able to observe our thoughts and emotions and memories without getting caught up in them. And generally in daily life, of course, we're going around with our eyes open, which means if we've done this practice only with eyes closed, we don't have the habit of observing thoughts and emotions with eyes open. Whereas if we do this practice with the eyes open, we have the habit of observing thoughts and emotions with eyes open, so it's going to be much easier to bring to daily life because we already have the habit of doing that. So that's the other benefit. Now, here, of course, these are not ideal situation for this meditation, because what might happen is, of course, with your eyes open, there may be some people in front of you that move a little bit, and so then you get attracted. You look around for that movement. But of course, at home, we can control that. We can even just have a blank wall in front of us, so there's nothing to attract the attention, and we can adjust the lighting. So here, if you find that with your eyes open, you're sort of starting to look around a lot, to help avoid that, just pick a spot on the floor in front of you and use that as a little bit of an anchor point. Again, we're not really looking at it, but we can have that as an anchor point to avoid starting to look around everywhere. So that's the practice we're going to do. Any questions about that practice? Anything not clear about that practice before we do it now?
I didn't understand why, if the eyes open, it prevents the non-duality.
Well, it won't prevent, but it will weaken it. Because with closed, there's really a strong sense of me in here and world out there. With eyes open, that breaks down, because there's no sense of strong sense of barrier of in and out, because the eyes are open. With eyes closed, there's a strong sense of in and out. So it won't get rid of it, but it'll start to weaken it. Particularly if the mind goes quiet in this practice, you will really there's often a very strong sense. You can often have a strong sense of no separation. So that's very, very helpful, because that's what we're trying to realize later in the Vipassana practice. Okay, let's do the practice. So we'll do a 20-minute meditation, and then I want to talk a little bit more about that practice after the meditation. So if you'd like to find nice, comfortable posture, we'll begin the practice.